Hello, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of MEMO's Weekly Review with me, Nasim Ahmed, and our regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Mouin, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Nasim. It's good to be with you again.
Yeah, it's lots happened over the past week. The major event, of course, was the strike by Iran in Israel. And I think we will dedicate most of the show to the fallout from that attack, and we'll analyze it from various perspectives. But let's begin with the attack itself, which is, of course, in response to the Israeli strike on 1st of April on the Iranian consul in Damascus. And I think everyone was expecting some kind of a response, and without knowing the details of that response, of course. But I don't think many people expected that the attack would come from Iran itself. I think many were thinking that in Iran would use some of its allies or proxies, whatever you want to call them, to strike at Israel or Israeli interests. So are you surprised by that decision to launch an attack directly from Iran itself?
Mhm.
And what do you make of the manner and the nature of the strike itself? Because some people have said this is really just maximum show with very minimum impact. So what do you make of that?
Well, I think it's important to also focus on the immediate and longer term background of these latest developments. But to respond to your question first, it was, I think, until the last moment, fairly unclear whether and how Iran would respond. The Israeli attack on the Iranian consulate in Damascus, from Iran's perspective, crossed a number of red lines because Iran and Israel have been engaged in what is conventionally termed the shadow war for several decades. And this brought it very much out in the open. And Tehran appears to have come to the conclusion of this far and no further, and that if they did not respond forcefully to Israel in the sense of also crossing very clear red lines, then Israel would simply continue to escalate against Iran. There were some indications that Iran was going to respond directly, all kinds of news reports that Iran had sent indirect messages to the United States that it would be hitting Iran, but did not consider this the beginning of a full-scale hostilities with Israel, and that it was going to do it in a way that would allow the United States to stay out of it. In other words, that it was not seeking escalation with the United States. It informed a number of neighboring countries about its plans to one degree or another. And then, indeed, the attack came in the form of hundreds of drones and missiles launched, as you mentioned, not by Iran's coalition allies in the self-styled axis of resistance, but directly from Iran, directly at Israeli territory. And I think, again, the message was, we're sending a very clear message. You have red lines that we are going to cross as well. And it was, I think, calibrated not so much to cause maximum damage in Israel, but to send primarily a political message. And in that, I think it very much succeeded, because in the aftermath, you had the United States, while condemning Iran, also making it clear that if Israel responded with offensive operations against Iran, that the United States would not get involved. And other Western countries said the same. So at present, it remains unclear whether and how Israel will respond. It's quite clear that the United States and Iran are not seeking further escalation. Israel is very keen to escalate further because I think its ultimate objective is to provoke a direct confrontation between the United States and Iran. So we'll see what happens in the coming days.
Yes, we'll see what the response from Israel will be and what role the US and its other allies will play. But I think one question that needs to be asked is whether this could have been all avoided. One big mistake may have been the miscalculation and the mistake of the US, UK, and France opposing a Russian drafted UN resolution condemning Israel's action, Israel's strike on in Damascus on the Iranian consulate. So there is a suggestion that if there was a UN Security Council resolution condemnation of that attack, Iran may not have retaliated in the way it has. So have the US and its Western allies supporting Israel miscalculated here? Could they have avoided this?
Well, there were miscalculations all around. I think two of the fundamental miscalculations actually date from several years ago. When the Biden administration first came into office, it took two fundamental and crucially important decisions. The first is that it would not simply rejoin the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear agreement that had been negotiated with Iran by the Obama administration and that the Trump administration subsequently unilaterally renounced. Instead, it sought to negotiate its way back into compliance with this agreement and posed additional demands on conditions on Iran that Tehran rejected. So that set the stage for growing US-Iranian tensions over the past several years. The second fundamental decision it made was to continue with Trump's broader Middle East policy in terms of what I've called the strategic neglect of the question of Palestine, prioritizing Arab-Israeli normalization, not in a manner that would use such normalization as leverage to end Israel's occupation of Palestine, but rather using Arab-Israeli normalization as leverage to further marginalize the Palestinian question and to allow Israel to resolve this unilaterally on the basis of its overwhelming force. And it's in the context of those two policies, I think, that we need to understand October 7th. After October 7th, the Biden administration continued by essentially subcontracting its Middle East policy to Israel. It gave Israel not only a free hand in launching what quickly transformed into a genocidal assault on the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, but also did very little to rein in Israeli escalation in the region. Of course, the escalation was initiated on October 8th by Hezbollah in Lebanon, acting in solidarity with the Palestinians, and subsequently various militias in Syria and Iraq, and then also the Houthi movement in Yemen got involved. But it was clear from the outset that the longer Israel's assault on the Gaza Strip was allowed to continue, the greater the regional escalation would be, and the greater the risk of all-out confrontation. And Israel, when it bombed the Iranian consulate in Damascus on April 1st, did not have to heed any consequences because it had essentially been given a free hand by the United States, and it acted on the assumption that it would have American support. Was it wrong? Well, look what happened in the aftermath. On the one hand, we heard reports that the Americans were furious with the Israelis for not having been informed of this in advance and being given a chance to veto it. But at the same time, as you mentioned, the United States, along with the United Kingdom and France, blocked the Security Council from adopting a resolution condemning Israel's strike on the Iranian consulate. And subsequently, Biden and other US leaders came out saying they stand shoulder to shoulder with Israel. So I think there's an argument to be made that if the West had imposed consequences on Israel and issued clear condemnations of Israeli behavior, this could have either prevented or led to a fundamentally different Iranian response. But by essentially backing Israel to the hilt, these Western powers, from Tehran's point of view, left Iran with no choice but to launch the response that it did.
I think we will get to what backing Israel to the hilt actually means, not just now and going to the future. As Biden said, his support for American support for Israel is ironclad.
Yes.
What does that mean, and what is the implication of that? But I think one question that I want to ask before getting into that subject is, could Iran have somehow made a strategic mistake here? One could argue, if Gaza is at the center of all this, Iran, by striking Israel, has given Netanyahu a get out of jail card free here. But the focus is no longer on Gaza. Israel, you could argue, has managed to get some sympathy, and its isolation is not as maybe as bad as it was before this attack. So has Iran fallen into a trap which Netanyahu has set by attacking Israel in this manner? Because that's what Netanyahu has been seeking all along, an attack from Iran to escalate and start a war, regional war with Iran and other coalition of the axis of resistance, as we would call it. So has Iran made a mistake in this regard?
I think there's an argument to be made there, that this latest crisis between Israel and Iran has diverted the focus from the Gaza Strip and at the same time reduced tensions between Israel and its Western allies. That's certainly a worthwhile observation. At the same time, even if you accept that Iran fell into an Israeli trap, you also have to ask yourselves, what choice did Iran have after this brazen Israeli attack on its diplomatic facilities in Damascus? Could it have simply looked the other way and continued with statements of condemnation of Israel and solidarity with the Palestinians, particularly after Israel's Western allies came out openly in support of Iran in the context of an Israeli attack that they would never have accepted if any other state had been the perpetrator or any other state had been the victim. I think Iran is also looking at various gains from its attack. They have shown once again that Israel, for all its bluster and bravado, is a state that is fundamentally incapable of defending itself, that it had to have extensive US and British and Jordanian and so on, not just support, but active participation in its defense against this attack. It has changed the rules of the game in Iranian-Israeli relations, stating that henceforth, any Israeli attack, not only on Iranian soil, but on any Iranian interests, will be met with a swift and more painful response. And of course, we'll have to see if and how this plays out in the coming days. But just as you can make the argument that Iran has fallen into an Israeli trap, you can also make the argument that Israel has fallen into an Iranian trap.
How would that be? In what way?
Well, in the sense that the rules of the game have been changed, that Israel went into this crisis thinking it was going to deter Iran and reduce its role in this shadow war. But in effect, Iran has now transformed it into openly announced hostilities between Iran and Israel. And secondly, that it has publicly demonstrated Israel's military frailty and dependence on its allies for its own defense, and therefore has also sapped the public confidence of not only Israel citizens, but of others in the region in Israel's ability to defend itself.
Yeah, I guess in any kind of military shadow wars. If you can get your enemy to expose themselves, all their strengths and weaknesses, that sets you up for a next round of attacks if that is to come.
There's that, and now Israel has a fundamental choice. Does it respect U.S. wishes to avoid further escalation and thereby leaves a direct attack on its territory without a response? Or does it choose to launch an attack on Iran that will lead to further strains in its relationship with its Western allies and sponsors?
So going back to the nature of the response we may see, Biden came out saying that it was a conversation between Biden and Netanyahu. I think it was yesterday. He said that the US will not commit to any response with the Israelis. So Israelis are basically alone, even though he has said the US offers ironclad support. There is a faction within the US, the likes of John Bolton, who are urging the US to strike at Iran's nuclear program. This is seen as one in lifetime opportunity to take out the government in Tehran. So what kind of response do you think we will see? It seems like the US is not really interested in any kind of response where it would be involved. So what kind of response do you think we may see from the Israelis?
Well, the United States, I think, has made very clear that it will not participate in any Israeli offensive operations against Iran, and has effectively made clear that it would not like to see any such operations conducted by Israel either, but that it would participate in Israel's defense if an Israeli response leads to further Iranian retaliation. In terms of how Israel may respond, Israelis have indicated that they intend to respond in a way that is, on the one hand, painful to Iran, and at the same time does not lead to further escalation. This could take the form of sabotage, assassinations, attacks on Iranian allies in the region. But given Israel's serial miscalculations, not least that on April 1st, it appears to have believed that it could strike the Iranian consulate in Damascus, and at the same time that Iran would be deterred from launching a direct response. I think Israel is likely to be overconfident in any response that it launches. And bear in mind also that the Iranians are now on record as saying that any further Israeli attacks will be met with a swift and more painful response, and it will be very difficult for Iran not to respond if it's attacked again by Israel. So there's a lot of pieces in this puzzle consisting of Israel, Iran, the United States, which is a key player, Iran's allies in the axis of resistance, other Western states, and also other regional states, such as Gulf states, which host U.S. military bases, and so on.
Yeah, there's a lot to consider in terms of the implications of an attack. But do you think there's also another aspect to this, which is Washington seems incapable of reining in Netanyahu? And could this be another way of applying pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu to say that your actions is risking a regional war, if not, a global war? And this is another way of Washington saying, you've taken this too far. We need you to rein in and apply pressure domestically and across, the world from Israel's main allies to say that, you need to stop what you're doing. And the track you're on is a track of ongoing conflict, more regional escalation. And could this be a way to say, could this be a way to apply pressure on Netanyahu?
Well, I think that's certainly an accurate description of how the United States sees the situation. The question is whether the Biden administration is willing to use the leverage that it indisputably has over Israel to transform its preferences into Israeli policies. And the record so far is very mixed at best, to put it politely. The United States makes its preferences clear. Israel acts as it wishes, and there are no or only minimal consequences for Israel for doing so. So it's entirely possible that in the current situation, Netanyahu and the Israeli leadership has heard very clearly from President Biden, from Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, and from others, how the U.S. sees the situation, but will move forward with the confidence that it can do as it pleases and not suffer any American consequences as a result. And I think we'd also need to remember the U.S. does not want to get involved into yet another war in the Middle East. The U.S. is rapidly losing confidence in Israel's military prowess. The U.S. has other priorities. They're in Eastern Europe, they're in East Asia, and somehow it keeps getting dragged back into the Middle East by Israel. Well, partially by Israel, but in important part because it has effectively subcontracted its Middle East policy to this fanatical extremist Israeli government.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think he's subcontracted some of his policies to the Gulf regimes as well.
Yes.
But that, which is why the response of the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE in particular, not to mention the other big players here, Russia and China, their response has been, I would say, quite significant. They've not condemned Iran, though they have called for de-escalation. So that's, to me, is quite an important factor. Why have these countries have not condemned Iran? And also Jordan, why Jordan's the only country, the odd one out in this case, in its position by defending Israel against Iranian strikes. So how do you understand Jordan's position in this, and also the other regional actors who have thus far not condemned Iran? And normally they are, bitter rivals with the Iranians.
Well, let's start with the Gulf states. They are indeed, as you say, bitter rivals with Iran. But at the same time, in recent years, particularly after a series of Iranian sponsored or Iranian supported attacks on their territory in Saudi Arabia, and I believe it was 2018, and then a number of Houthi missile strikes on Saudi Arabia and the UAE. These states have sought to normalize their relations with Iran. Of course, the rivalry and all the rest of it is still there, but they must be quite upset now, seeing how the United States scrambled all resources to defend Israel from an Iranian attack, but effectively did nothing when they were attacked, whether by the Houthis in Yemen or more directly by Iran on Saudi territory. And so they have basically come to the conclusion that they're responsible for their own security because this U.S. security umbrella isn't worth very much. And in that context, they have been normalizing relations with Iran and don't want to get caught in the middle of any Iranian-Israeli or Iranian-U.S. conflict, particularly those who also host U.S. Military bases on their territory that could be subject to Iranian attack. Jordan, I think, is in a different position. Of course, it shares the longest Arab border with Israel. It has a defense treaty with the United States that effectively gives the U.S. a free hand to do whatever it pleases militarily on Jordanian territory. And it has a very close security relationship with Israel. So it was in this context that Jordan played the role it did in terms of both scrambling its own air force to shoot down Iranian drones and missiles that entered its territory, and allowing the Americans and Israelis apparently to use Jordanian airspace as well. Now, the Jordanians would say that this had nothing to do with Israel or the Palestinians, and that it was a defense of Jordan's sovereignty and territorial integrity in airspace from foreign penetration. But I think to the Jordanian public, it will look very much like a Jordanian state that for 7 months has sat on its hands and done nothing while Israel pursues this genocidal assault against the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. But the moment Israel is under threat, it's all hands on deck and rushing to Israel's defense. So it's not a good look for Jordan by any means. And I think this crisis has placed it in a very difficult, arguably embarrassing position, which is one reason why Jordan would like this crisis to be over yesterday.
Yes, and I think it's got a lot of criticism, Jordan. All you have to follow social media and the Arab news, and you'll see the amount of criticism it's been getting. And also, this also points out another dimension, which is that the Americans did not pull out all the stops to stop Russian assault on Ukraine. They could have, I'm assuming, used the same kind of technology to bring down Russian drones in the same way they brought down Iranian drones, but they've not chosen to do that. Whereas in their defense or in their commitment to defending Israel, I think they're doing everything they can, but in their commitment to defending Ukraine, it doesn't seem like they're doing everything they possibly can.
Yes, the Ukrainians are apparently quite frustrated watching the way that the United States and other Western governments rush to Israel's active defense while refusing to do the same in Ukraine. Of course, there's a fundamental difference here. It's one thing to get militarily involved in a direct confrontation between Iran and Israel. Quite another to defend Ukraine against the Russian military on Ukrainian territory. And I'm sure this is a primary explanation for the difference in the two situations.
Mm. Let's turn our attention really to the moment itself. Many have said that this is really a really critical moment for the world. The Colombian president, Gustavo Petro, he issued a statement saying that we're basically on a precipice of World War III. I mean, how dangerous in your mind is this view? I mean, looking at Israel in particular, many analysts will say that Israel has failed in achieving its goals in Gaza. Its much vaunted deterrence capacity has been hugely undermined. Also, now, in particular, given how able to strike some of its targets in Israel, and also that it is the only way Netanyahu can stay in power. So everything would indicate that it's in Israel's interest, or at least in Netanyahu's interest, to start a major war, regional war with the Iranians. So that could escalate into all kinds of scenarios. So how dangerous really is this moment, given the psyche within Israel at the moment, and Netanyahu in particular?
Again, I think people who were expecting, or in some cases hoping, for an Iranian response to the Israeli attack in Damascus, were looking for its impact. In other words, they were looking for a very painful Iranian blow on Israel that would cause widespread destruction and devastation and so on. And they see Iran's apparent failure to inflict significant damage on Israel as exposing Iran in a sense as a paper tiger. I think we should look at it a little differently. It's quite clear that Iran choreographed its response primarily to achieve political rather than military objectives, to change the rules of the game, to inflict substantial economic losses on Israel as it went on alert and called up reservists and apparently spent well over $1 billion in missile defense. all kinds of red lines have been crossed and new equations made. And indeed, Israel's vulnerabilities have been exposed because the next time Israel won't have a week to prepare. The United States, the UK, and others won't have a week to bring in extra assets to defend Israel. And Iran has also demonstrated once again that for all its bluster and bravado, Israel, rather than being a military asset to the West, is a state that is incapable of defending itself without Western support. So the strategic equation in that sense is changing as well. Regarding the broader question that you posed, yes, we are at a very dangerous moment in time, regionally and also internationally. And the question then becomes is, will Israel's Western sponsors and allies allow it to drag the region into a full-scale war, or will they put their foot down and say this far and no further? My concern, as we were discussing earlier, is that the West, at least now, is making all the right noises, sending clear messages to Israel that they want no further escalation, that they will not participate in any Israeli offensive operations against Iran, but that Israel may nevertheless come to the conclusion that it is free to do as it will, and that when push comes to shove, the West ultimately will feel compelled to rush to Israel's defense, even if that means getting engaged in a direct conflict with Iran, which again, at least if it were up to them, they would hope to avoid.
Yeah, and which is why I find it quite strange why Biden keeps coming out and saying, Israel has ironclad support from the US, because once you say that, you weaken your ability to exert influence. Again, it's another indication of the impunity Israel enjoys. But a US president should realize that saying that Israel has ironclad support from the US, you're basically saying, go and do what you want. We'll always have your back. And that seems to be completely the wrong message that should be sent from Washington to Netanyahu.
Well, precisely. Sorry.
No, yeah, carry on. Yeah.
Well, that's precisely the point. I mean, if you look at how Biden has conducted himself since October 7th, he said don't to Iran. He said don't to Iran's allies. He said don't to anyone coming to the Palestinians' defense. He said don't to the United Nations Security Council. He has said don't to anyone and everyone except Israel. And while he now appears to be saying don't to Israel, the question becomes, does he really mean it? And has Israel been so conditioned to do as it pleases that even if Biden does mean it, Israel won't take him seriously?
Yeah, and I think Biden is realizing this ironclad support, it may be something which US presidents would want to offer to Israel, but current polls show that 57% of Biden's supporters, voter base, are against Israeli policies. So I don't think he has his voter base with him when he gives this ironclad support to the Israelis. I want to return to the point you made about the shift in the changing of the calculation. And one of the shifts that's taking place is people are realizing the cost of having to maintain the support of Israel, not just socially, domestically, but strategically as well. This is the first time America and Britain has directly been involved in defending Israel. And people were asking, what is the cost going forward in supporting Israel? Because, putting aside the failure of the Israelis to achieve its goal in Gaza, it seems like the regional integration which Israel needs is not something that's going to happen anytime soon. And you will have to have this Sparta in the Middle East for the foreseeable future, maybe for another 70 years, 80 years, who knows how many decades. Can the Western governments continue to give this level of support? So this is just looking ahead. Can they continue to give this level of support, especially now people have seen the cost of maintaining this garrison state in the Middle East, means that US soldiers may have to die. US may have to spend 1.2 billion, as was the case, in one single night to defend Israel. British planes have to be deployed. Is that really sustainable? And looking ahead, it seems like Israel is in the worst state it can be in.
Yeah, I think you've hit upon a key point. To be sure, there are multiple reasons that these Western governments support Israel, but ultimately there is one reason that rises head and shoulders above the others, which is that Israel is supposed to be a strategic asset. Israel is supposed to be what's termed the stationary aircraft carrier for American and Western interests in the Middle East. In other words, Israelis are supposed to fight and die for the West, not the other way around. And now you have a situation where this supposed garrison state is being defended by its American and European allies in the Red Sea, where Western military bases in Syria and Iraq are being bombed because of Israel. Where, as you noted, this past week, the West has had to scramble all these assets and billions of dollars to defend Israel. So that's not really how a garrison state is supposed to operate. And I think ultimately, perhaps for public opinion, well, not but clearly for public opinion in the West, it's Israel's genocide against the Palestinians that is the main factor in their assessment of their government's relations with Israel. But for the governments themselves, I think, they don't particularly care about human life and all the rest of it, but they must be asking themselves, what kind of a garrison state are you? Am I getting a good return on my investment? Why are you such a strategic burden? And I think this is going to have profound long-term implications for the West's sponsorship and perspective and perception of Israel.
And already you're seeing the fractures, especially within the American right over Israel. Before, Israel had ironclad support from all sections of the right wing in the US. Israel was seen as a strategic ally. And now you're seeing that fracture. And I don't think you can take that support for granted anytime soon. And you see that a lot more within the social media, key figures who are coming out saying that we need to stop our funding and sale of arms to Israel. But I mean, yeah, we'll probably have a discussion about that in a different show. I wanted to get your thoughts on two other key issues from the region. First is the killing of the children and the grandchildren of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh last week. What were your thoughts on that? I mean, is this another attempt by Netanyahu to basically derail all kinds of ceasefire discussion that's taking place? How did you view that?
Yes, that's the only explanation I can come up with. I mean, targeted assassinations of the Hamas movement's leaders' sons and grandchildren at a time when negotiations were resuming, I believe, in Cairo about a ceasefire and broader agreement. I really think it can have only one explanation. And the idea, I think, was that Hania and the other leaders would be so outraged that they would walk away from the negotiations. In that sense, it's been a failure. First of all, because Hania indicated that this would have no bearing on Hamas's negotiating position. And secondly, even if it did, I don't think Hania is a key decision maker in these negotiations. I think it's ultimately the Hamas leadership in the Gaza Strip that has to accept and implement any agreement that is reached. And without them signing off, the agreement is really just ink on paper. So from that perspective, I don't think this assassination, any more than the assassination of the senior Iranian officers in Damascus, met their objectives.
Yeah, and this will end on this. The other really puzzling thing was Germany cancelling the Palestine Congress or conference this week. arresting a number of Jewish campaigners, preventing Ghassan Abu Sitta, the doctor from Gaza, from giving a presentation. And in the same week, Germany was defending itself at the ICJ against the case brought forward by Nicaragua, accusing Germany of breaching the UN Genocide Convention. And in its defense, Germany said that defending Israel is one of its core pillars.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, to me, it suggests that, it's learned all the wrong lessons from the Holocaust. It shouldn't simply be defense of Israel. It should be, the lesson should be that you are alert to the abuse of state power and the dangers of using state power against a minority. That should be the biggest lesson, and that you should take forward. But Germany seems to have learned all the wrong lessons, given that it's still arresting Jewish activists from last week's Palestine conference. And I think Nicaragua has done the right thing in trying to prosecute Germany or bringing Germany to the ICJ.
Yes, I mean, German decision makers appear to have confused the phrase "never again" with "let's do it again," and it's not only their uncritical, unconditional support for Israel that is so outrageous, but it's the justifications they're providing that I find particularly obscene. That somehow the lesson of the Holocaust is that you need to support genocide. It's incredible, and also the suppression of any form of support for Palestinians on German soil. I mean, it even goes beyond that. Ghassan Abu Sitta and other people who had been invited to participate in this conference were apparently informed that even if they sent video links to their prepared remarks from outside German territory, they would be committing a violation of German law. So, talk about extraterritoriality. And what I found particularly interesting is that at the International Court of Justice, of course, the Germans started talking about principles and that they were doing all this out of some misbegotten moral lessons they've learned from the past. And the Nicaraguans, I think, quite rightly pointed out, well, you may be talking about principle, but look at all the arms deals you've made. You're earning quite a lot of money on this genocidal Israeli assault that you through arms sales and all the rest of it, that you claim to be supporting out of principle. So yeah, German hysteria, the hysteria in Germany this past year is really something to behold, and something that I think analysts will be devoting a very long time to trying to properly understand.
That was my guest, Mouin Rabbani. Thank you, Mouin.
Thank you, Nasim. It was good to speak with you. Thank you for having me.
And thank you for tuning in, and see you next week for another episode of MEMO's Review with me, Nasim Ahmed. Bye-bye.